Hey guys, it's Matt with Northwest Chrome. Today we're going to go over my setup that I use for fishing beads under a bobber for steelhead. So I've tried pretty much every technique for steelhead, and I found that beads have been by far the most effective. I mean, I've tried bobber and jig and pink worms and spinners and spoons and drift fishing eggs, and beads under a bobber seem to be the most effective for me. And there is a reason for that. So, I mean, the basic concept behind beads is that they are supposed to naturally kind of tick the bottom. So, you know, you're not dragging the bottom with the bead, but you just get that bead to kind of just naturally float along the bottom of the river like a single egg would. And I think it's really the presentation that is why they're so effective. So. Alright, so this is one of the rods that I use for bobber and bead fishing. So this is a Lamiglas X11. It is rated 6 to 12 pounds, and this is a 10'6" long pole. So I am a believer that I don't think you need an outrageously expensive pole to fish, to bobber fish, really for anything. It's not like drift fishing where you need to, you know, feel the bottom. So I don't spend a ton of money on fishing poles. X11, it's a nice rod. I mean, I've had it for a couple of years now and hasn't broke or anything yet. But I think the most important thing is just getting the right length as well as the right weight for the application that you're fishing. And I like using 10'6" for what I do, which is I'm mainly fishing from the bank. I think 10'6" is ideal for a couple of reasons. First off, it makes it easier to mend when you have a long pole. You know, mending is pretty important when it comes to bobber fishing, so you can keep a tight line and you can set the hook when you get a bobber down. And having that extra length, it does help you kind of holding the pole out in front of you. You can kind of manipulate the line a little bit easier when you have a longer pole. Also, I think with a longer pole, you get a little bit more casting distance. And, you know, since we're fishing from the bank mainly, and, you know, we fish all different kinds of, you know, sizes of different rivers, but when I'm fishing a medium to larger size coastal river in Oregon, I like a little bit longer pole and something that's got a little bit of whip to it like an X11 does, simply because you can cast it farther. And I like being able to cast this thing a mile, so a lot of my setup is kind of catered towards doing that. So now we're going to go over what type of braid that I use. I'm going with 30-pound Maxima Braid 8. Couple details with what type of braid you want to select. So I think 30-pound is ideal for bobber fishing. You know, you're typically going to be using anywhere between 8 to 15-pound leader, and it's nice when you get snagged up. You want to have a braid that is rated quite a bit heavier than your leader. The purpose of that is that when you get snagged up, you only break off your leader and you don't ever risk breaking off your main line. When you break off at your main line, you end up losing your bobber, and you have to retie an entire setup, and it's costly and time consuming. So you want to pick something that is a little bit stronger than your leader. And then as far as the brand of the braid, I mean, there's a lot of manufacturers that make good braid out there. I mean, I've tried Power Pro Super Slick is really good. Berkeley Fireline is another good one. But Braid 8 for me seems to be the one that it mends really, really well. Like, this stuff just jumps off the water, so it's pretty easy to mend. And then it also seems to cast pretty long ways, and it's very durable. I mean, I almost never break this stuff off. So, all right, guys. So let's talk about bobbers. So for this particular setup, I'm using an Aerofloat AF5 half-ounce bobber. So in terms of what size bobber you're going to be using, it's going to depend on what river you're fishing and the conditions. I find that half ounce is a good starting point for this. It's heavy enough that you can cast it out there, but it's not ridiculously big, so you're going to start spooking fish. If you're fishing low clear water, or you're fishing you know, a little smaller stream, you're going to want to downsize, but I think half ounce is a good starting point. And then as far as what brand of floats to use, I mean, at the end of the day, they all float. I mean, they're all bobbers and they do what, you know, you want them to do, but I find the AF5s, they track really well. It makes it a little easier to see if, you know, when your bobber goes down, is it a snag or is it a fish? So it does have really good tracking ability. and it's pretty durable. And then one other little detail I thought I'd go over is my bobber stops. So I'm sure most of you guys know already how to set this up as far as your, you put your bobber stop and then your beads and then your bobber. But one thing that I started doing is I switched over to these little rubber bobber stops. They're called little egg stops. I like these because you can reel them up into your guides without them moving. I also like that they don't get all shredded like the nylon bobber stops do. Nothing is more annoying than that. And when they do get shredded, you have to cut everything off. You have to put a new bobber stop on in the middle of fishing, which is annoying. But if you can see here, I've got actually 2 bobber stops here, and I do that because even regardless of what bobber stop you use, they all slip to some extent. So I find if you double up on them, it really reduces the chances that they're ever going to slip. It's just a lot harder to move 2 of them at the same time than it is 1. So that's just a little detail that you can catch fish without using 2 bobber stops, but it's just a nice little detail. And then before you tie it down to your main line, to your sinker here, just make sure you put a little bead underneath here on the bottom side. That will prevent your bobber from really slamming into the inline sinker. That will damage your bobber over time, and will save you a little bit of money on bobbers in the long run. Alright, now we're really getting down to the stuff that matters. So this is your inline sinker. So there is a ton of different ways you can set this up. You can do inline sinkers, you can do one of these cannonball sinkers, like you set them up, they're called Dave's Tangle Free Weights. I use these sometimes. You can use slinky weights. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but I've settled on the inline sinker as my favorite for fishing beads. There's a couple reasons for that. The biggest reason is that they just don't get tangled as often. So despite the name of Dave's Tangle Free Weights, I actually found that I was getting tangled more often with them. And I'm fishing from the bank, and I want to be able to cast this thing a mile without getting tangled all the time and having to cut stuff off and everything. So I just settled on the inline sinkers. They get tangled less than anything. I also like that they do sink pretty quickly. Certain weighting devices, they will, some sink quicker than others, and I want something that's going to sink quickly. I want to get down to the fish as quick as possible. And these inline sinkers, they're made of lead, so they're about the heaviest thing you can have. So I like that they do sink pretty well. Another benefit is they're kind of skinny. They're long and skinny, kind of like a pencil sinker, if you've ever seen those. They do have the ability, they can kind of bounce in between rocks, and they don't get tangled, they don't get snagged quite as easily as say maybe what do you call them, like one of those slinky weights. But anyways, this is going to be something that is based on, I think a lot of this is personal preference. Like if you're fishing from a boat, I might actually go over to one of the Dave's Tangle Free Weights. I think their sink rate is more ideal for like bobber dogging, but for this particular application of bobber and bead fishing from the bank, I think the inline sinkers are the way to go. Alright, so we're getting closer and closer towards the actual business end of things here. One thing, the last thing I wanted to go over as far as your leader is that I do use a little tiny split shot here. I don't know if you can tell, but about 2/3 of the way down the leader, I throw on this little BB size split shot. This is, if you put a split shot on your leader, you don't want to use anything huge. I'm just using the smallest type they have, which is BB size, and I put it about 2/3 of the way down. And this is just going to give you just enough weight that you can get it to sink at a little bit faster rate. Depending on what river you're fishing, you may not need to use split shot. If you're fishing something that is low clear water and there's not much current, you may not need a split shot. But I think for the majority of applications, I'm using a split shot. One little tip I can give you is that depending on what type of hole I'm fishing, like if I decide that I'm going to fish a little flat section or something that's not as deep, I'll actually move the split shot up, and that way it's not, the whole rig isn't going to sink quite as quickly. So this is something that you're going to have to kind of experiment around with. I even sometimes I'll add 2 split shots. I'll add a little bit bigger one up maybe 1/3 of the way down. But I'll do that just if I'm fishing, water that's a little boily, or if I really want to get down deep, then I'll use an extra split shot. But like I said, you're just gonna have to play around with it, and it's gonna be pretty dependent on what type of water. All right, so now we're going to talk about how I peg the bead and how far away to peg it. So there are a lot of different opinions on how far away you should peg your bead from your hook. I'm typically doing about 3 finger lengths away from the hook. So the purpose of this is that it's basically going to allow you to get a better hook set on the fish when you peg it a little ways away from the hook. The best way I could describe it is that if you move your bead right on top of the hook, there's a couple things that's going to happen. The main thing that's going to happen is that when a fish goes to bite the bead can actually get in the way of the fish grabbing it, and he won't be able to bite the hook quite as well. So by moving it up, you allow the fish to really bite down on it, and he can actually get fully hooked. Another good reason to peg it is that it allows the fish to, you're more likely to hook the fish kind of in the side of the mouth. You don't want the fish to swallow the hook all the way down into his gullet. I mean, we're fishing for rivers that have a lot of native steelhead in them, so it's important that you don't hook them all the way down in the gullet. And this is a good way to prevent you from doing that, but I'm not going to BS you guys. This is mostly because it helps you catch more fish, so pegging the bead is important for that reason. And then in terms of how I peg the bead, this is another one that there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I've settled on a system where I'm actually double pegging the bead. So I've got this little bobber stop that I put underneath the bead, but I also have a peg on the inside of the bead. I'm using one of these wedgies, and we may go over how to set this up in another video, but I do the double peg system because if you do the double peg, then you're pretty much guaranteed that this thing will not move. I find that most of the pegging systems, if you just do a wedgie or just a bobber stop, it will move after a while, and after a while they can move pretty easily. And if your bead is easily moved, if your peg is easily moved, then when a fish bites it, he's definitely going to move the bead, and he can move it right down to the hook. And if that happens, well, you might as well not even peg it. So yeah, that's why I do the double pegging setup. So bobber stop followed by a wedgie on the inside of the bead, and you shouldn't have any problems with your bead. Okay, now we get down to the hook. So a couple things here. You're going to want to match the size of your hook to the size of your bead. So there's a really good chart that we might put a link in the description to. But generally speaking, like if you're fishing a 12mm bead, you want to have about a size 2 hook. If you go any bigger than that, you want to upsize to maybe a size 1 if you're fishing a 14 or a 16mm bead. If you're fishing an 8 or a 10, then you might want to move down to like a size 4. But just match the size of your hook to your bead. And then there's a lot of different hooks out there you can use for beads, but I've settled on one that I always use for beads. This is called a VMC offset hook. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's kind of curved at the shank, and it's also at the tip of the hook. It actually curves just a tiny bit inwards, and I really like that because it keeps you from getting snagged as much. Like your bead is going to be touching the bottom a lot, and if you have a hook that's more exposed, then you're going to end up snagging up on rocks and stuff way more often. So I think for that reason an offset hook is useful. I also think that when you have this little offset at the shank, it seems like they hook, the fish get hooked better. If you just go throw on any type of hook, then certain hooks they're going to be able to really pop them off. But with the offset, it's going to allow it to really wedge into their lip, which is where you want them to get hooked. And then as far as the knot I tie, so I am very adamant that I think you have to use an egg loop knot or an improved cinch knot. So the reason for that is that if you're to tie just a regular fisherman's knot, it's going to sort of hold the hook at a weird angle. It's going to angle itself up like this. So your bead's going to be floating along, your hook's going to be at a weird angle, and when fish bite it, they're not going to be able to get hooked quite as easily. So I want something that's going to hold that hook so it's floating vertically. I want it straight up and down with the bead. And with the egg loop knot or an improved cinch knot, you're going to get that. You're going to have it so it's tied directly to the shank of the hook instead of right in the eye, and that's going to keep your hook straight. I just do an egg knot, an egg loop knot, because I've been tying egg loop knots for fishing for salmon forever, so I'm comfortable with tying them, but you can definitely use an improved cinch knot. Okay, and last but not least, we should talk about the type of bead that you use. So the most important thing with your bead is that you want to get a bead that is neutrally buoyant. What that means is that when it gets in the water, it's not going to naturally sink or float. It's just going to be neutral in the water. Now, they say neutrally buoyant. The beads that I use, these hard plastic beads, they sink really, really slowly. So when you drop them in the water, they're just a very slow drop rate. That's the most important thing with what type of bead to use. That is keeping with the whole theme here of getting your bead to naturally tick the bottom. You need a neutrally buoyant bead to do that. So now there are other types of beads. There are floating beads, and they have like heavy beads that are, as the name would imply, they're very heavy and they sink quickly. But if you're going to use different styles of beads, that's going to be a whole different setup. So if you're using heavy beads, it's not going to work on this setup. So if you're going to tie it up the way I have it tied up, use a neutrally buoyant bead. It's going to help you a lot. And then as far as size and color, I'm not a big snob as far as color and size go. I think that these fish, they see a pink thing or an orange thing or a red thing, and they eat it. I don't think there's much more trickery than that. Like, I know guys who think that, oh, you got to match the hatch, and well, you got to give them a dead egg because it's the season where the eggs are a little older. I don't think they care too much about that. I mean, if you find something that works for you, then great. But I find that if you stay within, orange, red, pink, then you're going to be, it's going to work just fine. I mean, if you're using a particular color of bead in a spot and there's fish and they're not hitting one color, then try something different or try a different size. What I do think is important is the size of the bead. I think that does make a difference, especially like if you're fishing really blown out water, which we usually just go home when it's blown out nowadays. But if you are going to fish kind of higher off-color water, then you want to upsize your bead. I mean, we even have beads that are like 20 millimeters, which I've never caught a fish on one, but you do want to use a bigger size bead when you're fishing more blown out water. Likewise, if you're fishing low clear water, then it's going to be wise to move down to maybe an 8 or a 10 millimeter. You just want to have a more subtle presentation when you're fishing low clear water. So, anyways, guys, I think that's about it for the bead video. Just give us a like, subscribe, and